Okay, we are going to begin our migration unit with looking at the causes, types, and effects of migration. Consider these videos in this lesson as some background as you really dive into your migration stations. So our goal is to see if we can figure out the different causes and factors that encourage migration, the types of forced versus voluntary migration, and then the historical and some contemporary geographic effects of migration today. We're going to begin here with the big picture of early human history. We understand that most of history has been told through a series of movement. When we look at migration push and pull factors, we have to understand that a push factor is any factor or situation or catalyst that is going to induce people or motivate them to leave a country. Each push factor then is generally going to coincide with a pull factor, a factor that entices or brings someone into a new place of residence. We're going to see multiple push and pull factors in our migration stations where we'll ask you to identify the difference. But we understand that, again, most of human history, movement happened because people were either leaving undesirable characteristics or they were moving to a new place, generally searching for a better way of life, which is why in many cases, the most common form of migration is voluntary migration, which is probably in many cases what early human migration patterns looked like. A couple more definitions to recognize here when you see the difference between immigration and emigration. Immigration with the IM is what we use to describe people coming into or filtering into a new region or a new country or a country of existence. Emigration, on the other hand, then, is when people live. Notice the E for emigration and the I for immigration. That's important to note if you're hearing people talk about the difference, to really recognize if they're discussing push or pull factors. Are people leaving, emigrating? Is there something pushing them or something pulling them and they're immigrating in? The other two types of migration, then, really what we've seen throughout a lot of human history is going to be inter-regional, if you look in the bottom right, versus intra-regional. Inter is going to be between, so from one region to the next. Most of early human history was inter-regional migration because people were constantly moving. We saw a lot of migration and relocation diffusion early in human history because there wasn't a lot of settlement. From East Africa into Mesopotamia, into some of our first city-states of Egypt and Greece, we began to see people starting to settle with the invention of agriculture. But prior to that, you had the daily, weekly, monthly, seasonal migration of hunters and gatherers. And so we have to understand history through a series of migration, even prior to what we think of it today, where someone is settling and then they pick up and they move somewhere else to settle. Early migration was pretty much a constant migration pattern. Whether it's push or pull factors, we saw people constantly moving for history. Originally, it was for food. Eventually, there's going to be many other catalysts for why people move. We can look here at some big patterns of global migration. This first map to your left is a map that was found on Britannica, looking at European exploration. And the right map is one that we've seen before. This one is cited from awesomestories.com on the Columbian Exchange. Any map that I don't explain or image I don't explain, you can assume has been labeled for reuse. What we see here in our early global migration patterns is that the rate of migration really picked up in the 1400s when we saw European exploration. Remember, Europeans were not the first to explore the world, but with European exploration, we began to see countries like Spain, Great Britain, France, Portugal, and others who really began to desire a need to trade their resources. And as they sought these new markets and these new consumers for trading their goods, we began to see culture diffuse. We began to see people moving and culture moving along with it. We're going to really focus on that more in our culture unit, but understanding the diffusion of language and religion, you cannot understand without understanding relocation diffusion. So as Western European exploration really began to move and diffuse around the world, we again began to see European influence around the world. We began to see in the Americas the Columbian Exchange, which we know brought with it many different types of crops and animals, but we also know it brought diseases. We know some indication is that 90% of the natives in America were wiped out, which is really why today we see such a European resemblance in the Americas because of this relocation diffusion. Again, remember, migration can be semi-permanent or it can be permanent, which is how we refer to it in many cases today. In Africa and Asia, this looked a little bit different. Because of proximity, there was a lot of diseases that were really in common with the Europeans and those living in Africa and Asia, and therefore many people survived the age of exploration from Europe. And therefore we saw many more mixed cultures, which we're really going to dive into again when we get into that cultural unit. But what we have to understand is that as people move, as people relocate, their goods come with them, their ideas come with them, their food comes with them. Some of their traditions, yoga is one that came from other areas of the world through religious tradition. And we have to understand the impact that migration really has had on shaping the culture and then the world in which we live, and so then we really can see one of the most significant impacts of European exploration and European expansion was the Atlantic slave trade that really took place between the 15th and the 19th centuries. What we saw, y'all, is on average, about 12.5 million Africans were captured, enslaved, and forcibly moved from their homes in Africa to North America, the Caribbean, and South America. Although the slave trade and slavery obviously is gone today, we know that some of the effects of slavery are still here. We know that 21 million people today, according to the United Nations, are still victimized by forced labor and in many cases from forced migration. If you look over to the right here, you can see a map from encyclopedia.us ushmm.org. And we're really going to explore refugees here. I want to make a note of two different definitions: a refugee versus internally displaced persons. A refugee is somebody who has crossed a border, maybe in search of asylum, which would be temporary, status in a new country, or who has fled because of their safety without anyone welcoming them into their country. An internally displaced person is someone who moves within their country, but to a place of safety. In just a minute, you're going to explore a quick document looking at the story of refugees and internationally displaced persons and those that have been forcibly moved from their home. You're going to look at the Syrian civil war as a case study to really try to understand how the political effects can impact where people live and why they live there. We've seen throughout history prior to the Syrian civil war in 2011, political and environmental causes for forced migration. We saw a major movement of the Jewish population who fled Nazi Germany between the 30s and the 40s in search of safety. We saw more at the local level, natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Harvey, which has forced people to move. And understanding forced migration paints a different image for us as to why people move and why they choose to move.